Good evening, everyone. I'm Marcus Fairs, founder and editor-in-chief of Dezeen, the online architecture and design magazine. And we're here at the Design Museum with Deyan Sudjic, director of the Design Museum, Harriet Harris, who's a researcher from the Royal College of Art, and Nina Hertig from design studio Sigma. Now, I'm going to get them to explain a little bit about who they are in a minute. But firstly, the topic of tonight's talk. You probably all know it's the 100th centenary of the Bauhaus this year, but did you know that last year was the 50th anniversary of the invention of the modern tap? It was invented by Arne Jakobsen for Danish design brand Vola, who are very kindly supporting tonight's talk. And the slightly maybe provocative topic that we're going to talk about is, broadly speaking, has Danish design done better than Bauhaus design? Bauhaus famously swept away the old design of the past, but I think if you were to go into most of our houses, it would probably look more Danish than Bauhaus, possibly. Anyway, to compare the two legacies of these great eras of design, I'm going to first of all hand over to Deyan. First of all, Deyan, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then I think you're going to give a little presentation about Danish design and the Bauhaus.
Thanks, Marcus. I did write a book once called B is for Bauhaus. It wasn't actually about the Bauhaus at all. It was more about me, which is...
D is for Deyan. You should have called it D is for Deyan.
No one would have bought it then, of course. But it did talk about the Bauhaus at one stage. And I suppose before we talked about that, maybe it's worth talking about the Design Museum as well, because here we are in its new-ish home. We moved here 2 and a bit years ago from basically Bauhaus on the Thames, which was a building that Terence Conran acquired when he started the Design Museum almost 30 years ago, and turned what had once been a very modest brick-built banana ripening warehouse from the 1950s into what very much looked like a tribute band to the Bauhaus. White walls, flat roofs, austere typography. And I think it does. That's one of the signs of that continuing impact that the Bauhaus had. But the thing about the Bauhaus, of course, it was never actually one thing. We think about it in terms of Walter Gropius himself, and we think of the Bauhaus as being this, I suppose, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, a place in which Tom Wolfe's famous onslaught from Bauhaus to My House, or earlier than that in England, where Evelyn Waugh came up with this sinister fictional character called Professor Otto Silenius, who was half Gropius, half Freud perhaps, who was seen as this alien evil influence, demolishing the English traditions of comfort and utility. So there's been a kind of long drawn-out, complex relationship, on the one hand being impressed, on the other hand not being. But the Bauhaus was never actually one thing. This is the cover of the first prospectus, the Bauhaus manifesto as it were, and this is anything but functionalism. This is expressionism. It was the cathedral of light, the cathedral of modernism. And in the early days, the Bauhaus was far from that being one thing. It was not one monolithic idea about what the world might be. It was Gropius, but it was also the remarkable Johannes Itten. I was hoping for the other photograph, which shows the rear view, in which he's had cut into the back of his crew cut a star. Itten was a fire worshipper, a Zoroastrian, a vegetarian, who brought a group of his students from Vienna in the early days of its Bauhaus foundation to join Gropius. And he was the inventor of the foundation year, which is still something which shapes art education, design education around the world. And he was anything but a utilitarian functionalist believing in machines and mechanizations. He was something else altogether. And the Bauhaus wasn't just Walter Gropius either. This is the Swiss second director of the Bauhaus, Hannes Meyer, who was brought in by Gropius to start the architecture course. And at that stage he was being hired, played down the fact that he was a member of the German Communist Party. And 2 years on, the mayor of Dessau by this time was under such pressure from the growing right in Germany that they begged Gropius to come back. Gropius didn't, but he said, try this guy, Mies van der Rohe, Mies reacted very badly to the legacy of Meyer. Meyer was an extreme materialist who believed that form really did follow function, and at one point suggested that Meyer suggested that life was starch plus sugar plus light plus oxygen, or something, words to that effect. Mies's response was, put that together and it stinks. And of course, the other thing about the Bauhaus was that it actually did change the world in terms of the Bauhaus diaspora. Gropius went to Harvard. Mies never forgave him because he was sent off to provincial Chicago, and always felt that Gropius had been this aristocratic Prussian ex-cavalry officer, whereas he was the son of a horny-handed mason. But in terms of architecture, I suppose you have to say that Mies's legacy is far more powerful than Gropius's, but Gropius was probably a much more impressive educator and teacher. Mies's idea of a lecture, or a tutorial rather, with his students was to smoke that cigar for half an hour, or maybe an hour, and then say yes or no. And of course the Bauhaus did have this sense of reducing things to their essentials. This was before Herbert Bayer introduced the idea that uppercase capitals were an unnecessary elaboration, and that the world should be entirely in lowercase. Ottleicher, the founder of one of the Bauhaus's following institutions in Ulm after the war, once actually wrote a serious essay in which he suggested that if only Germany had been not quite so addicted to uppercase letters, they could have resisted fascism more easily, which does say something about graphic design, which is wonderful, but can sometimes seem like looking at the world through a letterbox. Right. Okay, so on to Denmark. Is there a natural connection? What are we talking about in terms of these comparisons? A Hans Wiener chair, in this case the Y, on one level has very little connection, you would say, with Breuer's cantilever tubular steel chair, inspired. There are many different versions of what inspired that first tubular steel chair, but a constant part of the myth is it was either Breuer's own bicycle or the bicycle of the postman delivering mail, which inspired him to put this material to work in very different ways. Whereas you could say that Wiener was working within the tradition of making, which is one of the parts of Danish identity at that time, and design training in Denmark for a long time took the form of an apprenticeship and cabinet making, and certainly that chair comes from that tradition. And this is Arne Jakobsen's cutlery. We've got a show actually opening at the museum in late April next month. And this cutlery actually was what was chosen by Stanley Kubrick's art director for the space station in 2001. Interesting idea. The film made in 1966, 65 would choose these objects only then, just designed at that time, but representing the near future. And this is Jakobsen's famous hotel, the Gesamtkunstwerk, from the cutlery to the large scale of the architecture. Here it is in the interior. This is Jakobsen's best achievement in Britain, St. Catherine's College in Oxford. And I suppose in its way that it actually did look at creating a complete environment in which every piece seemed to belong to every other piece. You could see that also as the product of the Bauhaus's thinking on combining all the arts. That sense, I suppose, that, what Gropius had in mind when he started the Bauhaus was to make art, design, architecture, craft, textiles, all part of one thing, in which no one of those was privileged above the others. And I suppose that is also a sense of Denmark, which projects a sense of its democratic ideals, could be seen to be sharing. If we think of Jakobsen as a rationalist, it's hard to see that quite in terms of this kind of astonishing object. But you can actually see the same view of what design might be throughout. Bang & Olufsen, it wasn't, of course, designed by Jakobsen, it was Jakob Jensen. But for me, that Baolite 707 radio on the right, which has a a tuning system, which is basically a slide rule, sort of suggesting precision, or in its form it could actually take on if you blew it up to 4 stories, it could be a Danish town hall. You see that kind of sense of first principles design, which again might be a reflection of what the Bauhaus was teaching. But there were also others, Nana Ditzel, a different kind of Danishness and a modernity, which went through to the architecture. You could see it also in the design of the public realm. Jens Nielsen, who designed the corporate identity for DSB in the 70s, sadly they've got a much less interesting view now. It did learn things from British Rail, but again a kind of very sense of direct boldness. Stelson vacuum flasks, again that same sense of aesthetic, that sense that all these things could have been, they're designed by different people, but they could all belong very closely, very comfortably together in the same room. You'd have to say that Denmark is not one thing, as demonstrated so ably by Werner Panton, a very different flavour of what it might be. And just to finish, let's also not get carried away by national stereotypes, which can be somewhat misleading. Britain has had a love affair with Denmark, that sense that it is the home of all things tasteful and elegant and quiet, but also it's the home of Bjarke Ingels and Big, kicking over the traces, and it's also the home of Lars von Trier, the exact opposite of Danishness as seen by its designers. Thank you.
Are you saying that Bjarke Ingels is not tasteful and quiet, Deyan?
How did you guess?
And also, you talked about how the Design Museum began in a sort of Bauhaus-esque banana workshop on the Thames and has now moved west, where there's a lot of sort of Scandinavian blonde wood around. Does that mean you've kind of rejected functional minimalism for something more cosy?
Well, this is Danish oak, it's true. It's extremely functional, it lasts, and I think that the way that this museum looks is partly the fact that it's inside we've inserted a new building inside a 1960s landmark, and what we've done, I hope, is to put something quiet inside quite a noisy English attempt at modernism.
Something tasteful and quiet.
You said that, I didn't.
But the Bauhaus obviously came out of a school. There was a place where this aesthetic and this idea, as you pointed out, it's much more complex than many people think. But did Danish design have a similar kind of crucible, or was it just lots of people who happened to be doing similar work around the similar time? Was it really a movement? Did it spring from somewhere?
I don't think it ever had the same rhetorical flourishes that the Bauhaus did. I mean, that was, I think the idea of producing a manifesto for a school of design was Gropius's masterstroke. He was also very skilled at attracting students through celebrity endorsements. He persuaded everyone from Bartok to Einstein to show up at one or other of the schools. They were constantly having exhibitions of the students' work, again to attract more students. So what I think made the Bauhaus what it was that powerful sense of being able to communicate one powerful idea, which might oversimplify what it was, but it certainly worked in that sense.
And we talk about the Bauhaus diaspora. I mean, people, they left or they fled Germany. Lots of them went to America. Some of them came to the UK. But was there a connection with Denmark? Was there a sort of personal transfer of knowledge from the Bauhaus to that part of the world?
Well, Jakobsen himself had to flee Denmark at the time of the German occupation. He went to Sweden, rowed across the water. Denmark's a small country. It's 6 million, 7 million. Help me out here. And that's a very different mindset from this kind of this global centre.
It's also quite close to Germany. But just finally, before we move on to Harriet, how in those days, how did ideas communicate? I mean, you started out as a journalist. You launched Blueprint magazine. I'm a journalist in the digital era. But how did the Bauhaus communicate beyond its own borders what was going on? I know it had a magazine, didn't it? But it had a very limited circulation. How quickly did the ideas spread, and how did they spread?
Well, it spread remarkably quickly. It produced Itten from Vienna. Marcel Breuer was a Hungarian. It had English students, it had American students. It did have that sense of conviction. It seemed to be the place, which, as I've said, was in part to do with Gropius and his second wife, Isa Gropius's great publicity skills. They kept themselves in the public eye. The fact that the Nazis hated them probably didn't hurt from that point of view either. It became a badge of honor to be interested in their work.
And I think is it Lars Muller, the German publisher, has managed to collect all of the original. The Bauhaus had a magazine, and apparently they had a very limited circulation.
German. He's not German, actually. He's Danish.
The publisher.
Yeah.
And but he managed to assemble a collection of all of the Bauhaus magazines, and he's republished them. But it was quite easy for him to get hold of the early editions because hardly anyone bought them. But as they went on, they got more and more rare. So he's just put that out there as a complete set of Bauhaus design magazines. Must have been one of the first design magazines, I guess.
I think you guessed probably wrong. There was something called the Architectural Review, which started in the 19th century.
Okay, anyway, over to you, Harriet. I'm just Deyan's foil tonight. Happy to be proven wrong. Harriet, first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I think the reason I'm here is because I'm quite interested in looking at the untold story of the Bauhaus, which relates to the women's contribution to the movement. So firstly, I'm normally at the RCA, by the way. I run the research program. And I generally write books about architecture education and try to restore women to architectural history in a range of different, if you like, genres and ways. So I suppose the Bauhaus women particularly intrigued me because you have Gropius with obviously his manifesto for the school, which is largely something that in many ways pilfered a lot of intelligence from the British arts and crafts movement. But it was really committed to the idea of making as a pedagogy, so making sure that people were actively creating in a hands-on way in order to generate theories. But he had some really curious ideas about women's intelligence. So he believed that women could only think in 2 dimensions rather than 3. This is my rather dubious illustration. And for that reason, they weren't actually allowed to study architecture. They were, in many ways, forced into things like weaving, which was fine to some extent because obviously many of the things that they produced in the weaving room had 3-dimensional capacity, and I'm sure anyone in the audience who's a textile student or someone involved in fabrics would share my view. But they did still manage to produce architectural outcomes. Sometimes, though, these outcomes were actually appropriated or misattributed. So here's an example. In one example, this is Annie Alber's work. So what you can see in these 3 images, actually they're pretty big up there, they're quite small down there. So Annie Albers was married to Joseph, the architect. She was one of the many women condemned to weaving. And what you can see in the illustration is one of her examples of a layout for one of her weaves, which was then taken into a brick facade by her husband a few years later. So it's quite an interesting example of how a textiles, if you like, experiment or prototype has then transposed into another discipline and used in a way that's celebrated, unfortunately, by a man in this particular case. Similarly, you have Lily Reich's work. So this is some examples of chairs that, if you Google, are actually attributed to Breuer rather than her. But if you look back on the traditional catalogue numbers, which I think you can just about see on the screen, most of the chairs that we would attribute to him are actually her initials, which is something that only boring old archivists like me would necessarily know. But it's quite frustrating when even Google gets it wrong. And another example here of Benita Koschotter's work. She was obviously part of the Hans Horn project, and she did a really interesting schematic for furniture that was then used to inform part of the kitchen design, which is obviously where a lot of crossover with Danish design comes to the fore. And I think also it's important to look at the theories. So a lot of the women in the Bauhaus were writing spatial theory, but talking about it in the context of weaving. So a lot of the, if you like, ideology underpinning not only the manifesto for the school, but if you like, broader commitment to industrialization, affordability of design, so making sure that it was really universally accessible, and universal design is obviously incredibly Scandinavian. But that kind of commitment to democratizing design really was coming from the women weavers rather than the men. They were much better at industrializing their work. Wow, that slides in a random place. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about the Danish tradition before Bauhaus. So there are two main tropes historically within Danish design in relation to the Bauhaus. The first was obviously before the Bauhaus closed down. So what you have before the Bauhaus came along is a tradition, a Danish tradition of obviously designing exquisite products exclusively for the aristocracy and the wealthy. They were obviously very much interested in the vernacular of craft, exquisite ceramics, and often using natural materials, chairs. And I think if you like, all that forest came in useful, and it continues in many ways to inform, if you like, that area of design. But it was this emphasis on making by hand, on doing things that, if you in some ways had an inherent deformity or an error, because that's in a way the beauty of handmade work, that if it's not machine produced, then there will always be an inherent uniqueness to it, because we can never manufacture things identically as human beings. We just do not have that capacity. So in the 1920s, what you had is the Danes, who were really good at doing things like carving things out of bones. This is somebody working away with a bit of reindeer horn. There is, in fact, one remaining reindeer horn factory in the whole country right now. And then what you have is a school which is obviously committed to looking over its shoulder across Europe for these new innovations and new ideas about design. And some of the thinkers within the school, and here's one example, Carl Klint, who was obviously taking on board some of the traditions that were coming from the arts and crafts movement. And remember, arts and crafts and also Art Nouveau had this kind of weird tussle thing going on the whole time. And this is all happening around the same point in history. So there's this, I think, tension between doing things that are somewhat florid, with too many organic flourishes and too much emphasis on detail, or trying to make allusions to nature, and then something that was yearning for a simplicity, something that's more usable, that's easy to manufacture, and how that's starting to disrupt this, if you like, instinct towards over-embellishing. And we've seen examples such as the pH lamp, which is again Paul Hannigan lamp, which is something that we see, which has remained something incredibly popular, that's had no adaptations. And I suppose that's one of the things that's remarkable about this genre, within the first wave, if you like, of the Bauhaus influence, is this still what you can see is quite a natural form. This looks very much like a flower or a shell, and yet it's been completely boiled down into this simple, easy to manufacture and mass produce object that's, through its utilitarian approach to production, made it affordable and accessible to a great number of people. And similarly with the chairs, I mean, this is again examples coming from the Danish tradition. Again, this something that almost looks like it's made of beveled horns, which is the chieftain chair. And then actually moving into something, as we've seen with Arne Jakobsen's work, the egg chair, which is, again, has an allusion to natural forms, using traditional materials in this case, because it was the first editions were leather-clad, but really pushing itself towards something more of the plasticity and fluidity of modernist sculptural elements. And then again, the Spanish chair, almost strangely coming later within that period, but still really holding on tight to the idea of woodcraft and natural materials and symmetries. And then obviously you have the House and Horns example, which was in the Bauhaus case. Again, this is going back to the first, if you like, era of influence between the Bauhaus movement and Denmark. This house, which was developed basically as a showcase of all of the Bauhaus thinking and intelligence, and everyone was given kind of segments of it to re-envision. But there's something really intriguing about this particular format. So there's a few things to note. One is that actually having very little emphasis on having anything on display. So there was a kind of agenda to hide away surfaces as much as possible. And actually make the surfaces continuous. So in a way, the modern kind of worktop was invented within this kitchen. Up until then, you would have an individual table and you would have an individualized cooker. But what you wouldn't have is almost a continuous landscape across the cooking area. So this idea is really brought forward and substantially influences the work of the Danes. And here's an example, not necessarily directly related, which is the National Bank of Denmark, which is in fact where the Vola taps were first installed and invented for. This is 1961, Arne Jakobsen. But again, you have a utilitarian staircase made, if you like, sculptural, but all of the bank's functions and identity entirely concealed away. And this kind of philosophy, the idea of a continuous surface, is something you can see not only with the interior of this space, but the exterior as well. And it was then taken forward into the tap. So again, it comes back to this idea of user-friendliness, not having cables or pipes on display, but something, all of the kind of technologies concealed, and then this entirely delightful user interface exposed externally. And obviously what that now translates into today is this sense of a tap that, having been reproduced and appropriated and in many ways exploited through all kinds of knockoff versions, is something that we identify as entirely modern. And I think that really speaks to the testimony of the Danish interpretation of Bauhaus, that it's, again, committed to an agenda for making the Bauhaus ideals even more accessible to diverse users. So it isn't just about the affordability, but about the tactility dimension. You know, this is a tap that can be used by people with dexterity challenges or disabilities. And again, the way that something is so iconic that it doesn't matter what colour or context, we still identify it entirely as this celebrated design icon. That's it for me.
Thanks very much. And this, the sort of underappreciation or almost a kind of belittling of women during the Bauhaus era, how did that get discovered? I mean, were the women sort of writing secret diaries of how oppressed they were being, or was that just considered a social norm at the time? At what point did we start to realise, or people like you start to realise that, hang on a minute, it wasn't all the kind of the hero guys doing all of the good work?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, for me, it started by just noticing patterns in things like facade elements or products between what some of the women were doing as, as pots or kettles or teapots, and also in textiles, and realising that if you look at the date of some of that work and then the date of work produced by men a few years later, where those patterns, if you like, were resurfacing, there was evidence of appropriation, whether that was formal, if not within the same discipline, it was evidently there. So that was the starting point of a bigger discussion. But there have been a number of books written that start to try and focus on the women's contribution, but they are obviously focusing on the textiles more than anything. It's only when you realise that the women were actually often collaborators, and by implication we know historically that being a female collaborator in a male-female team usually means, certainly in architecture, that you're not likely to be fully recognised for your contribution. So with that as a problem, it's through that excavation you can discover women's contribution, and also through their books. So they tried to publish their books, but under the guise that they were speaking to textiles or speaking to a broader Bauhaus manifesto. But it was, again, it comes back to looking in a somewhat tedious way through the archives at the dating of the materials, and then seeing these ideas reiterated in a slightly different way through the writing of the men.
So I guess the answer is detective work then, in a way.
Yeah.
It had to be revealed. Deyan, you wanted to say something?
It's not entirely true to say that women weren't allowed to study architecture at the Bauhaus. No one did till Meyer got there. And you have to say also that at least they let women in, which is more than Harvard Architectural School did, till Gropius got there.
Well, no, I mean, it's interesting. I guess we have different historical references, and maybe that's the problem of the archive, is that they are subjective and they can be contested. But this is obviously written down in a number of academic texts that this was the case, that women were not permitted to study architecture.
There was no architecture school till Hannigan.
No, but when there was any sort of ability to study architecture, they were not allowed to. I mean, initially they were not even allowed to do any furniture work either. They weren't allowed to work in three-dimensional studies, and that was something that was later rescinded. But yeah, it's obviously a debate for the archive.
It's clearly the case that women had a very hard time there, as was in other places. But I think it's Gropius himself, I think, did acknowledge the kind of position of women. He was close to Marianne Brandt. He did the best for her when the Nazis took over Germany. So yes, you're right. There was no equality. But I think to portray it as universally a kind of sexist enterprise is a bit harsh.
I don't think I'm suggesting it's a universally sexist enterprise at all. I'm just recounting what's been found in the archives about letters that have been written and statements that have been made by Gropius about women's spatial capabilities. I think that, the women's contribution was recognised, but they were given, let's just say, certain mediums through which to express their creativity. I think that there were obviously wider contextual and structural disadvantages that weren't to do with the Bauhaus at all. They were to do with, if you like, the economy of the time. And as you said, up until then, many women weren't even allowed into design schools at all, or any kind of art school. So, yes, one could be grateful to be allowed into an art school at all or a design school at all. But then, if it was equal, then there should have been equal access to all of the programs, and sadly, that was not the case.
Sure.
Well, that was actually going to be my question, because it sounds like it was unusual that there were even women allowed there in the first place. So how did that come about, that women were even allowed into the weaving workshop at the school rather than completely excluded?
Yeah, it's a good question how they actually came about. I mean, it was obviously part of the manifesto, but it was a lot to do with the relationships of the men involved, because many of them were in partnerships with the women. Obviously, partnerships, I'm talking about emotional attachments, not necessarily business-related attachments. But I think it was also to do with the fact that there was, a different kind of spirit back then. I think we've had the First World War, where women were actually called into the forces and given opportunities to work in roles traditionally assigned to men. We have across Europe, women were being given the vote. So you're at this point in what we call first wave feminism. So they have a lot more political agency in public life. So they were making a much more conspicuous contribution. And I think that was partly why there was a kind of new belief, if you like, in women's potential, that in a tragic way the First World War had provided an opportunity that hadn't really been given to them before to show what they were capable of. So I think, that strangely after that, what you have is a kind of stronger embrace of women's contribution to creativity and design. I think, though, that many of the women, and certainly much of the archive reports, that women were treated as craftspeople rather than designers or artists. And in many ways, textiles was seen as that, as a sort of craft and very gendered. And often women's work at that time, whether it was artistic or design related, was partitioned around notions of craft and so on. So that was in some ways limiting as to, if you like, how it might have been valued or interpreted. But I mean, I brought women here tonight as a discussion point, not as a kind of Trojan horse on a subject about where we're here to talk about Danish influence, but because it's really understanding that when you're looking back over history, and we always talk about the men of the Bauhaus, that we're doing a disservice to the many women who were, I think, given only very limited means about how their contribution could be realised and recognised. And even since then, we've had, it's not as if sexism evaporated at the end of the Bauhaus. I mean, decades after, we're still struggling for women to gain equality within the design world. And as a consequence of that, they, even now, history books fail to give them their due, as we've seen, and that continues to be a problem. So I think it's interesting looking at how they used alternative disciplines in some ways to disrupt the pedagogies, to disrupt the politics of the place. But, that their contribution, especially in terms of the industrialisation of the products, was actually something that has never really been extensively acknowledged, but is really important in terms of the Bauhaus's international success and, by implication, influence in places, across Scandinavia.
And what about Danish design then? What contribution did women make to that? Because now we look at Denmark and it's considered one of the most equal societies in the world, one of the most equitable. We know that, for example, in Denmark and wider Scandinavia, in terms of childcare and women's access to the workplace, that more women are involved in architecture and design today in those kind of countries. But what about back then? Because in our discussion about Danish design, the post-war era of Danish design, I think we've only mentioned men's names so far.
Mm. But you've got your talk, right?
You've got Nana Discipline.
Am I preempting what you're going to say?
They're definitely there.
Okay, so maybe we should move on to you, Nina, because you were going to answer my question with pictures.
My name is Nina Hertig. I am a co-founder of Sigmar, which is a London-based company. And for the past 20 years, I have been buying, handling, and selling design pieces from the 20th century, mainly Danish, Scandinavian, and Austrian pieces, with a strong focus on not on the mass-produced later pieces, but on the earlier pieces, which perhaps could be read as the foundation to Danish modern. And also working very closely with a workshop in Vienna, the Werkstatt of Karl Auböck, which is a family workshop that was aesthetically founded by the grandfather, who was one of these 8 students that Deyan talked about, that Johannes Itten brought over from Vienna to set up the foundation course in Weimar. And I think it's important to talk about the different segments again that Deyan also talked about, that you have a Bauhaus that started out with a very clear aim to unify art and design, or arts and craft again. They wanted to bring those two together and create something bigger. And that obviously changed when in 1924, when they moved on to Weimar, the aesthetics became something different. It became something that was much more egalitarian, or something that was much easier to share with the rest of the world. And this house that we've all shown, which is the Haus am Horn, represents that transition in so many ways. It's the whiteness that we all see, it's the blocks, it's the purity, it's the empty space. And just to compare what was going on in Denmark at the time, I'm going to show you a different version of empty space. This is the inside of a church built in Copenhagen. It's the work of Cora Klint, who's also been mentioned before, and his father, P.V. Jensen Klint. And it was a competition that was won in 1913, so before the First World War, but it wasn't executed until after the First World War. And it was not finished until 1930. But you can see very clearly the two different interpretations of what modernity is and what space and void and nothing is. And I think that's very important to remember, that this church is also pure and simple. It's yellow brick inside out. There is nothing else. The pulpit, everything is built out of yellow bricks. But it's poetic, it's warm, it's so many things. With these things, and you touched upon it again, you put objects and individual things, I think it's important to remember that Denmark and Germany are culturally linked, they are geographically linked, but when you're talking about the interwar period, they were two very, very different places. So Germany came out of the First World War impoverished, on their knees. You had inflation. You know, the Bauhaus had... I remember Carl talking about his granddad came back saying that they had no food at the early Bauhaus. You know, they had very basic problems with that. Him and his partner, Carl's grandfather's partner, they had to share one pair of shoes because they didn't have two pair of shoes, so they could only walk out of the house one at a time. In contrast, Denmark had been neutral during the war, and they were incredibly wealthy. They'd done very well. They're merchants. They had traded with everybody, and they made a lot of money. So in 1920, say 1923, 24, when the Bauhaus was very much operating, Denmark had the biggest collection of contemporary art. And by contemporary art, outside Paris, I mean Cubism, Post-Impressionism, etc. Gertrude Stein would travel to Copenhagen to see good art. I mean, that's the reality of the two environments that created the design that we're talking about today. And this is a crematorium. So I'm showing you lots of interiors, which are entireties or works of art. I would call them Gesamtkunstwerk, which has been mentioned before, which I think is incredibly important to understand Danish design in the 20th century. This is a little-known architect called Fritz Schlegel, and it's actually a crematorium. The materials used are simple. It's bent wood, it's plaster, it's color, but it's very, very different to what we've seen in the Bauhaus so far. And also worth mentioning again is Wilhelm Lauritsen, who was a very influential architect. He produced also objects. Finn Juhl started his work from him, so you see the lighting, etc., is very much his work. And I think looking at it, you're looking at the sculpturalness of it. You're looking at this could almost be, a cubist painting or something abstract where the shapes take a different shape, meaning. And this is the Radio House in Copenhagen, which to many people this is the closest connection you've got with the Bauhaus in Danish architecture. I think there are clear references to some of the work that Gropius did in the purity of the shape, in the window. But then you have different types of materials, luxury and organic shapes moving in. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's very quiet. It's a comfortable aesthetic compared to the Bauhaus that wanted to revolutionize, to change the world, Hannes Meyer wanted the world to be communist. This is not the aim of the design that you're seeing coming out of Denmark. And this is Arne Jakobsen that we're also speaking about today. This is a work that he did during the war. It's from 1942, and it was a collaboration with Erik Møller, another architect. But I think, again, if you're looking at it as a Gesamtkunstwerk and you're looking at the elements as sculpture, you can refer that back to the products that we've been referring to. So the Vola tap, the cutlery, all of these things were part of a context, and they were sculptures. I think it's a well-known fact that Arne Jakobsen wanted to be a sculptor. I think there's stories about him when he was doing the egg chair. He was actually in his summer house, which is 100 kilometers north of Copenhagen. And the manufacturers were in the southern part of the island. And these two poor guys had to spend 2 weeks driving back and forth with big plaster molds of the chairs. And they would duly deliver it to him in his summer house, and he would scrape off. It was little millimeters of the top and say, okay, that's back, that's good. And then they would have to go back and cast it again and bring it up to him, and he would scrape a little bit again. And they did that every day for 2 weeks to adjust the shape. And when you look at pieces like this with the fountain, with the furniture, etc., I think it's very evident that he had aspirations to become an artist, not necessarily an architect. And this is probably the most famous piece by him that we've again seen references to. It's the interior of the SAS Royal Hotel. I think from the exterior that Deyan showed, there are clear references to the Bauhaus architecture, to what was going on in Chicago, to what was going on in Germany, but interior-wise it's a completely different thing, and each element has a sculptural and warm response to the problem. So that's that's my.
But I'm going to ask you the question I asked Harriet though. So, what about women in Danish design? Was there a similar? How involved were women in? Again, most of the names you mentioned were men.
I think it's such a big topic, and I think that we've been asked to. But again, there are strands. There is the early Bauhaus. There is Cora Klint's school of thought in Danish Bauhaus. In Danish modernism, there are. Hans Wegner to me is a different thing. There were women. There were women who were architects. There were women who were cabinet makers. We were talking all of the interiors that we show here really also fed the industry for making first wooden furniture and then later on in different materials, in steel, in glass, and all these things. But they were just not as well known as the men. And I think that the reality was also that you were talking about childcare and all these wonderful things. I'm pretty sure that they weren't available in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s and 50s. But they were there.
I should have mentioned to the audience, but we will be taking questions a bit later on. But I want to sort of broaden out the discussion. It's interesting that you compared the kind of economic situation in Germany at the time with the Bauhaus with the situation in Denmark later. And so we could maybe look at this as like the Danish design scene did a very good job of kind of becoming merchants for ideas that had been developed at the Bauhaus, commercializing them in some way. What you talked about the manufacturer being 100 kilometers south or whatever, but what was the industrialization and the kind of commercial scene in those days?
Again, I think you have to differentiate between the period up until the Second World War and the period after the Second World War. So in the 1924, which seems to be a seminal number for everything here, it was the year that Cora Klint started teaching at the architectural school in Copenhagen. It was the year that the Bauhaus moved. It was also the year that the biggest bank in Denmark crashed and essentially sealed off the economy or any outside competition up until after the Second World War. So you had what you would probably today call a cottage economy supplying furniture. It was very competitive. And they started engaging architects first to design for them to get the competitive edge over their competitors and gain the job, which the tradition continued of going to commission your furniture when you needed some. And I think that's where the entire foundation for Danish modern lies. And it was never commercialized the same way as that you see in the States or even in Germany.
Dan, I thought you were holding your microphone to your mouth because you wanted to say something.
No, I'm poised, waiting for your next question. But
no, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the kind of relationship. Okay, so the Bauhaus, radical ideas, a condition of kind of poverty, and we're talking about like I guess in all of Europe, a sort of cottage industry of craft. The figures at the Bauhaus, how did they think that their ideas would be made and sold to people? Did they have a kind of a business plan, or was it just sort of ideas and creativity for its own sake? I mean, all of you feel free to contribute.
Well, for a Marxist, Hannes Meyer was quite successful at actually commercializing Bauhaus products. There'd always been the idea that the work of the studios would actually be licensed and sold to raise funds for the school, which went into textiles particularly. Bauhaus wallpaper actually was used by Albert Speer when he was decorating the Nazi Party's election offices in Berlin. This wallpaper with the death of me, as Oscar Wilde once suggested. So yes, there was that sense that this was actually about engaging with the commercial world around them. The products that were designed by the masters themselves were then commercialized in different ways. Tubular steel furniture started appearing everywhere. Quite who was responsible for the first tubular steel chair was the subject of a huge argument between Mark Stam and Breuer.
But the story about the tubular chair being inspired after seeing a bicycle, I mean, I would imagine that in those days bicycles were made in factories and there was an element of mass production to them, but chairs, from what you were saying, Nina, were not made in that kind of way. They were almost commissioned or crafted.
Not in the beginning. They were later on. As this grew, you also realized that you had something that you could export, and the little workshops grew, and the scale of the factories grew. So a lot of companies that started out as little, what we today would call master cabinet making workshops, turned into quite big factories, but still continue. Their roots were in wood. They tried with tubular steel. You saw Fritz Hansen did tubular steel in the 1930s. You saw PH did tubular steel, but it never caught on. And I think that had to do with the aesthetic of what they could sell in their home market first. And the Germans were really good at it. It's not an easy thing to go in and compete there.
And the central question of tonight's discussion is which had the more successful legacy. I mean, if you were to go down to Knightsbridge or Kensington and look around the stores there, I mean, you'd probably have to conclude that Danish design had been much more successful. But how would we compare the kind of the mass appeal of those two different aesthetics? Why is Danish design so popular today? We haven't mentioned the dreaded H word, have we? The word I cannot pronounce and probably should not pronounce.
I think it's because it's essentially evolutionary, it's not revolutionary. So it took the influences and it took the freedom that the thoughts and the experimentation that was going on at the Bauhaus and said, yeah, this is really interesting, and it opened doors, but it never necessarily went through it. It stayed with something that people could relate to. And everybody had their own approach. Some were measuring everything until death, trying to figure out what was comfortable, what was important for the body, what was important in nature. PH famously criticized the Vasily chair that you also showed for being, it was irrelevant because it wasn't comfortable. Little things like that connects you to, as a human being, to the product that's there, and that was very important to them. And I think you can see that in we were also talking about the tap. It's a sculptural piece that also connects you to the environment. And that's the secret of the success, is that you as a human being can relate.
Have you got anything to add to that, Harriet?
No, I think I kind of mentioned the user-friendly aspect of things and everything that Nina's just said, really, that proximity to substantial forest in many ways kept people, or kept the products that were being made, they always maintained some sort of proximity to natural materials or processes. So even now, for example, though the tap's obviously made from recycled steel, big emphasis on repurposing, and I think that it's that the human factors dimension of Danish design that I think is what makes it what has made it so successful and enduring, and I think that speaks to really how I think potentially within war depleted Europe, in the diasporian interpretation of the Bauhaus. I think a lot of the designs that went over to the US felt very much of that post-war period, post-Second World War industrialization. You've got a relentless supply of American steel, the best in the world, and there's a kind of what do we do with this stuff? We'll just keep punching out chairs and we'll keep building stuff out of steel because there was just this kind of endless resource available to designers. And that obviously, we've seen the kind of Rust Belt emerge in the 1980s and so on, and a kind of new relationship with steel, I think. So I think that it's a lot to do with how we now relate to those kind of materials. I think that we've seen a rise in environmentalism, particularly in the last 10 years or so, and obviously it's a pressing concern right now. So these forms and these ways of making things that have some embodied sustainability or a connection to natural materiality are more likely, I think, to be successful than something that was produced in a much more, if you like, materially unembarrassed way.
Deyan, same question.
I suppose there's two things happening at the same time. We look at the Bauhaus and we somehow associate it with the heroic period of modernism when the utopian dreams hadn't started to leak. And we look at that moment and we see a particular idea of what the world of design might be in architecture. And we look at these images of Denmark, which seem to really spring from a moment maybe 2 decades later. And as dreams, that Danish idea of what life might be like now seems more appealing than the idea of tubular steel and flat white roofs. But a deeper question is really what these two traditions give us now, and what is it that the idea of what design might be from that Danish perspective might be now. And Harriet's talked about ethical sustainability, which is something which I think all of us have to embrace. And the Bauhaus's dream now is a different one. I suppose it's hard to pin down what the Bauhaus is. As I've said, it was so many different things, but the kind of most powerful slogans are about that idea about a machine age, about mechanization, which don't seem very appealing ideas now, and they don't seem quite so. I mean, it's hard to understand what the Bauhaus's approach to a digital design course would have been, for example.
But we're sort of almost painting a picture of Denmark at that time, and even now being just people in the middle of forest and just going and, you know, calmly soaring and chiseling. But Paul Hannigan made metal lights. I mean, there's quite a sophistication. I mean, how did he even do that? You can't go out into the workshop and press a ring of steel, can you? And then chamfer the edge as easily as you can. Just take a chisel to a piece of wood. Did he have access to kind of advanced industry?
So Paul Henningsen is who you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Well, most of his experiments were done in paper. So he started everything in paper, and I don't know if but most Danes will recognize Paul Henningsen more as a cultural commentator than a designer. He was much more influential for his writings than he were for his design. And if you look at his design now as well, they are perhaps not the most influential. They've sold well, yes, but they haven't inspired a movement. But yeah, he started out sitting with paper because there was only one type of light bulb, and he wanted to break down the light into a comfortable light. So this is also what you see. There was a reference to his metal shades, but most of his early pieces from the 20s were glass, and the glass was tinted to create either a dining room light or a study light or a comfortable light for you to perform the task that the light was supposed to be a part of.
Interesting. So paper is kind of from trees, isn't it? So he even found a way to get it from the forest. And finally, before we hand over questions, hand over to questions from the audience. The Panton chair in plastic. I mean, that's a kind of like the odd man out in a way, isn't it? This story of kind of forestry and sustainability. Like, how did the plastic thing fit into this story?
He was sick of being seen as a Danish designer working in wood, I suspect. And it was only Vitra which actually managed to make his idea of this reinforced plastic work.
And he did it in Switzerland, right?
Yeah.
Did he laboriously carve the first prototype from a huge chunk of wood?
No, he certainly didn't. I think he got his hands rather kind of messy with what's basically boat building fiberglass techniques.
But some people will probably say that there is a predecessor to his chair, which is Paul Kjærholm, who did one in papier mâché, which is exactly the same shape, about 5-10 years earlier.
And I guess that the Vola didn't try to make a tap out of wood. That probably wouldn't have lasted 50 years, would it? Anyway, thank you very much to my wonderful panel. Thank you very much for Vola and to the Design Museum, and thank you very much to our audience for joining us tonight.